I won't ask you to imagine yourself sitting in a prison and think how it was invented, but if you're watching this video, you're undoubtedly interested in knowing about the invention of prisons and about the person who introduced confinement as a means of punishment. You might think someone just invented them, like smartphones or rockets, but surprisingly, that's not the case. In this video, we will share everything that no one tells you about the history of prisons. The concept of prisons is as old as the cave people are. The idea of taking one's freedom away as punishment took birth from their time and gained its shape of a cell with the advancement of human civilization. You might be surprised that nomadic people constantly moving to hunt and gather food didn't have prisons. Building a giant jail or confining someone in a cave wasn't practical at their times, nor could they drag around a heavy prison cell with them. Yet they were wise enough to punish others. They often punished the criminals through harsh physical punishments or kicked them out of the tribe. The concept of punishment among these moving communities might have been short-time lockups in caves or pits for someone considered criminal. However, as humankind progressed and big civilizations like Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome appeared, the concept of imprisonment also developed. These were people who built homes and settled in big cities. So, building jails became a possibility. This is the reason some of the very first written laws found in their manuscript actually mention imprisonment. One code, the Code of Ornamu, was written in 2100 BC, and it mentions jail time for kidnapping. Another famous law code, the Code of Hammurabi, allowed people to throw debtors in jail if they couldn't pay their bill. But hold on. Because these first prisons in human history were not as facilitated as today. Most likely, these were dark cells, perhaps full of foul smells, stingy mosquitoes, big rats, and itchy bugs. Initially, imprisonment wasn't the main punishment. It was a waiting period, what you now know as jail. Probably the criminal awaited something way worse, like exile, execution, or even being forced to fight to the death. Chinese used jail for some crimes, but sentences were usually pretty short, like a few months. In the early 16th century, Aztecs, the Native American people who dominated northern Mexico, were a whole different story. They had better, specialized prisons for different purposes, which served as waiting areas until the issue was resolved. They had dedicated prisons for people on death row, for debtors, and even for minor crimes. Thus, during the early 16th century, our world knew about jails, but confinement was not the main punishment back then. Also, prisons were not yet the high-security buildings you have today. After the Aztecs, we moved towards the Middle Ages. Here, punishment was all about being tough on crime. Public shaming, whippings, and tortures were common. Public shaming often involved devices like stocks or pillories, where criminals were mocked and sometimes even attacked by the crowd. The goal of the punishments was to scare everyone and make sure nobody even thought about breaking the rules. Jails existed for those waiting for the punishment. These were dark and damp underground rooms inside those massive castles. These dungeons lacked sanitation and ventilation. In other words, they were home to illnesses. And guess what? From petty thieves to murderers, all were thrown together in the same dark cells. Things got a bit interesting around the 16th and 17th centuries. People started to think that jail shouldn't just be about punishment. Criminals should get a chance for positive behavioral change. It was believed that jails could be used to improve these criminals through hard work and religion. This led to the rise of the House of Correction and workhouses in prisons. Criminals spent their time scrubbing floors, mending clothes, and listening to long lectures about right and wrong in these prisons. These were the first prisons to implement the concept of rehabilitation. Bridewell Palace was converted into a house of correction in England in 1553. This set a precedent for similar institutions across Europe. Still, conditions were often harsh in these prisons. Cells were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and even malnutrition. The actual idea of rehabilitation failed, and prisons became punishments. However, the shift in thinking made people realize that criminals could be transformed into good citizens, instead of just throwing them away. This was a turning point in the history of prisons. Jails were going to be rehabilitation centers. Fast forward to the 18th century, a whole new kind of prison, known as the penitentiaries, were introduced. Following two different philosophies, the Philadelphia and Auburn systems, these places started focusing on making criminals regret their bad deeds. The Philadelphia system focused on religious reflection and allowed prisoners to spend long hours alone in their cells with only a Bible for their company. The Auburn system, on the other hand, focused on hard labor in silence. Prisoners would work long hours at tasks like weaving or breaking rocks. They were not allowed to speak to each other. Thus, with the end of typical punishments, prisons became less scary in their society. But these penitentiary systems had a dark side too. Solitary confinement in these prisons resulted in mental breakdowns and suicides. This was a period of experiments and failures, but it laid the foundation for modern-day prisons. The 19th century came with the standardization of prisons. Influential reformers like John Howard and Elizabeth Fry played key roles in advocating for better conditions and humane treatment of prisoners during this period. So, a national prison system with standard buildings was introduced. These new prisons also separated criminals based on gender and crime severity. Eventually, those dirty debtors' prisons were mostly abolished. Indeed, these prisons weren't luxury resorts, yet standardization offered better rules and facilities. These new prisons also started sorting criminals based on their gender, male, female, or children, and the seriousness of their crimes. Similarly, stinky cells were reduced. Serious criminals were sent to prisons for longer periods. However, petty thieves had shorter sentences. Things got a little more humane too. Prisons started offering basic healthcare, like medicine, for criminals when they got sick. They offered education, like reading and writing. Religious guidance was also arranged. Chaplains visited prisons to preach and offer guidance for those seeking forgiveness from God. The best of all, dark, hell-like prisons were mostly finished now. Learning about all these reforms, you might think these prisons would have become paradises by now. Well, that's not the case. The population grew, and likewise, the number of prisoners swelled. So, what happened then? Prisons were overcrowded, facilitation fell short, criminals lost their temper, and this resulted in violence. Thus, despite reforms, population growth posed new challenges, which needed better handling. With the 20th century's scientific and industrial advancement, authorities started looking forward to introducing fact and data-backed prison reforms. They wanted to stop criminals from going back to crime after they got out of prison. This was another step towards prison-com rehabilitation centers. Another big change occurred when different countries created more persistent rules and improvements in prisons. Plus, a new type of sentence, early release based on good behavior, known as indeterminate, popped up. Basically, instead of a set jail time, criminals could now get released on the judge's orders from prison if they had persistent good behavior. Sounds nice, right? Still, not everything was sunshine and rainbows. Plenty of harsh practices existed, like chain gangs working in brutal conditions. Protests began against these punishments. People demanded more humane treatment. Unfortunately, in the mid-20th century, the number of prisoners skyrocketed instead of expected reforms. This overcrowding resulted in worse conditions and frequent prison fights. Frustrated and angry prisoners had quarrels over trivial matters. Thus, the dream of reform ended in prison disputes. Fast forward to the late 20th century and beyond, the war on drugs changed the prisons dramatically. The government's crackdown on illegal substances caused a massive spike in prison populations. Additionally, the three-strike law was introduced for repeat offenders. This means the repetitive criminals were supposed to stay in prison for extra-long punishment periods. Thus, jails became more crowded than ever, and conditions often worsened. Thankfully, today's prisons are different from those of the past. Many developed countries have better prisons where inmates are classified based on the severity of crimes. They have better cells, have access to rehabilitation programs like job training and addiction treatment, and provide basic healthcare and education. However, even though some developing countries offer rehabilitation programs, their prison conditions can be just as harsh as 20th century jails. Today, prisons have come a long way, from a simple concept of abandonment and dark, scary holes to complex systems with a focus on rehabilitation. Just like a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly, prisons have evolved alongside human society. Today, there's still debate about the best approach, but one thing's for sure: the history of prisons is a wild ride. Let us know in the comments what you think about the modern-day prison system and what changes you think are still needed to improve it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more exciting content.